The first day of seventh grade was supposed to be like any other. Awkward glances, nervous laughter, and the dull hum of introductions. But the moment Max Carter walked into room 314, everything shifted. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and there was a coldness in the room that made him uneasy. Mrs. Gristle, the new teacher, stood at the front of the class, her piercing gaze sweeping over the students like a hawk sizing up its prey. Her cold smile didn't reach her eyes, and Max immediately felt the weight of her presence, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. She was tall and thin, with sharp features that seemed to be carved out of stone. Her hair was pulled back tightly, as if every strand had been forced into submission. The deep, dark circles under her eyes made it clear she hadn't gotten a decent night's sleep in years. She wore a long black dress that looked out of place in the bright, slight, cheerful classroom filled with posters of school spirit and motivational quotes. It was almost as if she belonged in another time, another world, and Max couldn't help but wonder if she'd just wandered out of some creepy old mansion and decided to teach middle school as a side gig. "Welcome to room 314, she said, her voice smooth and cold, like the edge of a knife. "I'm Mrs. Gristle. I don't believe in wasting time, so we'll get right to work." Max exchanged uneasy glances with his best friends, Jenny and Leo, who had been assigned seats next to him. Jenny, the pragmatic one, looked as if she was already calculating how long they would have to endure Mrs. Gristle's icy stare. Leo, ever the joker, was trying to stifle a snicker, but quickly stopped when Mrs. Gristle's gaze flickered toward him. Max could almost feel the air shift in the room, growing heavier as she turned her attention back to the board. She began writing something on the chalkboard in a hurried, almost frantic manner, her hand moving too quickly for the students to follow. Max squinted, but the words seemed to flicker and blur before his eyes, as if the chalk was not making marks on the board at all. He rubbed his eyes and looked again, but the strange symbols she'd written remained indecipherable, like a foreign language that didn't belong in a classroom. Max's confusion grew, but he didn't dare speak up. Mrs. Gristle had a way of making you feel like even breathing too loudly was a violation of some unspoken rule. She turned back to the class, her eyes narrowing slightly as she surveyed the room. "I expect respect in this classroom," she continued, her voice cutting through the silence. "I do not tolerate disruptions, distractions, or disobedience. If you fail to follow my instructions, there will be consequences." Her eyes locked onto Max for just a moment, and he felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if she could see right through him, like she knew exactly what he was thinking. Max quickly turned his gaze away, focusing on the desk in front of him. But the discomfort in the air didn't fade. There was something about Mrs. Gristle that unsettled him deeply, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't just her eerie demeanor or the way her voice seemed to freeze the very air around her. It was something more, something lurking beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself. The bell rang, signaling the end of the first class, but Max was in no rush to leave. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to Mrs. Gristle's desk, as if it held some secret he had to uncover. As he stood up to gather his things, his eyes were drawn to the corner of the room where an old wooden door stood slightly ajar. It was the only thing in the room that wasn't pristine or new. It looked out of place, almost like it didn't belong in a modern school. Before he could ask Jenny or Leo if they had noticed it too, Mrs. Gristle's voice cut through the noise. "Max Carter, I'd suggest you take your time and learn what's truly important here this year." Max froze. How did she know his name? It wasn't on the roll yet, and she hadn't called it. He turned slowly to look at her, but she was already looking away, as if she hadn't spoken at all. The warning hung in the air, and Max had no idea what he was getting himself into. He had only just met Mrs. Gristle, but he already felt that the strange and unsettling atmosphere in the room was a prelude to something much darker. Something he would soon find himself drawn into, whether he wanted to or not. The next day, Max couldn't shake the unease he felt after his first encounter with Mrs. Gristle. As he walked into room 314, the air seemed just as heavy, if not more so. The walls, once decorated with colorful posters and welcoming phrases, now seemed dull and lifeless, their brightness swallowed by the darkness that seemed to creep in from every corner of the room. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent classroom. Max sat down at his desk, glancing at Jenny and Leo, who were already seated next to him. Jenny's brow was furrowed, her eyes scanning the room with the same wariness that Max felt. Leo, as usual, was trying to lighten the mood by tapping his fingers on the desk in a rhythmic pattern, but his nervous energy was palpable. "Something's off today," Leo muttered, his voice low. Jenny nodded. "I don't know what it is, but I feel like we're being watched. It's like she knows everything we do, even when she's not looking." Max didn't reply. He couldn't put it into words, but he felt it too. Mrs. Gristle was no ordinary teacher, and it wasn't just her strange demeanor or the way she kept staring at them as if she could see into their very souls. It was something deeper, something darker, and Max could feel it pulling at him, tempting him to uncover whatever secret Mrs. Gristle was hiding. The bell rang, signaling the start of class, and Mrs. Gristle entered. She didn't speak a word as she walked to the front of the room, her eyes scanning the students as she passed. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, the sound echoing like a countdown to something unknown. Max sat up straighter, his heart racing as she turned toward the blackboard. She didn't write anything immediately, but instead turned to face the class, her gaze lingering on each student for a moment longer than usual. When her eyes met Max's, the chill he had felt the previous day returned in full force. "You all seem unusually quiet today," she said, her voice smooth and icy. "I hope you're not expecting things to be easy. I don't tolerate laziness or boredom. If you want to learn in my class, you will give me your full attention, or you will leave." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Max swallowed hard, his palms starting to sweat. He glanced at Jenny, who was biting her lip, clearly struggling to hide her unease, and Leo, who had gone completely still, his usual carefree expression replaced with one of deep concentration. Mrs. Gristle's eyes moved across the room once more, and Max felt as if she was looking directly into him, as if she could read his every thought. He quickly turned his gaze toward the desk, hoping that his discomfort wouldn't be obvious. Without another word, Mrs. Gristle began writing on the board again, this time with even more speed and precision. The symbols that appeared were the same as those from the day before, strange, twisting shapes that Max couldn't make sense of. It was as if they were shifting before his eyes, blurring in and out of focus, leaving him with a sense of confusion and dread. Jenny raised her hand cautiously, her voice shaky when she spoke. "Mrs. Gristle, what are those symbols? We've never seen anything like that before." Mrs. Gristle's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something cold passing through them. "You're not here to ask questions, Miss Allen. You're here to learn. If you don't understand something, that is your problem to figure out. No more interruptions." Jenny's hand fell to her side, and Max could see the flush of embarrassment creeping across her face. But the unease wasn't just about the teacher's coldness, it was about what she had said. "That is your problem to figure out." It was a warning, but Max couldn't understand why it felt like a threat. The rest of the class proceeded in an oppressive silence, the only sounds coming from the erratic scribbling of Mrs. Gristle's chalk against the board and the occasional shuffle of papers. Max's mind raced, but he couldn't focus on the lesson. He couldn't stop thinking about the strange symbols, the way they seemed to pulse with energy, as if they were alive. And there was the door that had caught his attention the day before. It stood slightly ajar, as if inviting him to discover whatever was hidden behind it. Max's curiosity grew with each passing moment, but so did his fear. There was something dangerous about Mrs. Gristle, something that made him feel like he was being drawn into a web he didn't fully understand. He couldn't shake the feeling that room 314 held a secret, something dark and ancient, that Mrs. Gristle was hiding, and he was getting closer to uncovering it. Finally, the bell rang, signaling the end of class. The tension in the room lifted, but only slightly. As Max gathered his things, he couldn't help but glance at the door again. It remained slightly open, as if waiting for him. His heart raced as he made his way to the door, and he couldn't ignore the sense that something was calling him to explore it. Whatever secret Mrs. Gristle was hiding, Max was determined to uncover it. But he couldn't help but wonder if doing so would come at a cost he wasn't prepared to pay. The days that followed seemed to drag on endlessly, each one feeling heavier than the last. Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that he was being pulled into something far beyond his understanding. The more time he spent in room 314, the more he felt like a pawn in some sinister game. It wasn't just Mrs. Gristle's unsettling presence or the strange symbols on the blackboard. It was the way the classroom itself seemed to warp around him, the air thick with a sense of foreboding that didn't let up. By the third day, Max, Jenny, and Leo had grown more and more aware of the oddities surrounding them. Mrs. Gristle's lessons were becoming more cryptic, her words like riddles that hinted at something darker. The symbols on the board grew more elaborate, more twisted, as if each one was a key to unlocking something terrible, something that no one was meant to understand. The students no longer dared ask questions. Even the simplest inquiry seemed to provoke a sharp, icy response from their teacher. It was during a particularly quiet moment in class that Max first noticed it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of Mrs. Gristle's chalk scraping across the board. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, a trick his mind was playing on him due to the mounting tension in the room. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. It was a voice, soft but insistent, coming from the corner of the room near the old door that always seemed to be slightly ajar. Max's eyes darted toward the door, but Mrs. Gristle was standing right in front of it, her back to the class, as she continued writing her cryptic symbols. The voice, however, persisted, though it was still too faint to make out the words. Max's heart began to race. He wasn't sure if anyone else heard it, but he had the overwhelming sensation that someone, or something, was trying to get his attention. "What's going on?" Jenny whispered, her voice barely a breath. Max looked at her and saw that she, too, was looking toward the door with wide eyes. Her face was pale, and she clenched her hands into fists, as if trying to keep herself from shaking. Leo, on the other hand, looked more confused than scared, his brow furrowed as he glanced between the door and the front of the classroom. Max felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He glanced at Mrs. Gristle, but she seemed oblivious to the strange atmosphere that had settled over the class. The whisper came again, louder now, and this time, Max was sure it was calling his name. Max. His blood ran cold. It was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was calling him. Before he could react, the door swung open just enough for Max to see inside. The space beyond was dark, far darker than it should have been, given that it was only a few feet away from the bright, well-lit classroom. Max could just make out shapes moving in the shadows, though they seemed to be more like shifting figures than solid objects. He felt drawn to it, like a moth to a flame, despite the overwhelming fear that gripped him. Max turned to Jenny and Leo, but they were both staring at the door now, their faces stricken with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Jenny's lips trembled as she whispered, "Do you think we should go in?" Max wasn't sure. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to push the strange pull away and pretend nothing was happening. But another part of him, the part that had been so intrigued by the mystery surrounding Mrs. Gristle and the classroom, felt compelled to find out what lay behind the door. Before he could answer, Mrs. Gristle's voice sliced through the air like a knife. "Max Carter, what is it that you're looking at?" Max jerked his head back to the front of the room, his pulse pounding in his ears. Mrs. Gristle's cold, sharp eyes were fixed on him, and for a moment, he felt like he was trapped in her gaze, like she could see through him and into every dark thought he had. The room was unnervingly silent, the weight of her stare like a physical presence. I wasn't looking at anything, Mrs. Gristle," Max stammered, trying to steady his breath. She didn't respond immediately. She simply continued to stare at him, her lips curling into a thin smile that sent a wave of unease through him. Max felt like he was being judged, like every move he made was under a microscope. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and Mrs. Gristle finally turned away, her sharp heels clicking on the floor as she moved to her desk. Max felt an odd sense of relief, though it was mixed with a lingering dread. As the class filed out, Jenny grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "That door, it's not normal, Max," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something wrong with it, with her." Max nodded, his throat dry. "I know. I've been hearing something, voices, from behind the door." Jenny's eyes widened in shock. You heard it too? I thought I was going crazy. Cat Leo, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up then, his voice low. We need to figure out what's going on here. This place, it's not just a school. And Mrs. Gristle? I don't trust her. Max agreed. The feeling in his gut was undeniable now. Something dark was unfolding around them, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he knew they were getting closer to something they weren't prepared for. The days after their unsettling encounter with the door seemed to stretch out like an endless night. Max, Jenny, and Leo couldn't focus on anything at school. Every moment was consumed by the mysteries of room 3114 and Mrs. Gristle's increasingly strange behavior. The whispers Max had heard continued to haunt him, always faint but persistent, always pulling him toward that dark, ajar door. It wasn't just a door anymore. It had become a symbol of everything they couldn't understand, everything they were too afraid to confront. But the feeling that something was calling them grew stronger, more urgent, with every passing day. On the fourth day, the tension finally reached its breaking point. Max had decided that he couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something in that room, something hidden away, something that could explain everything. The strange symbols, Mrs. Gristle's cryptic lessons, the voices that seemed to whisper his name. He had to know what lay behind the door. But this time, he wasn't going to face it alone. He had to tell Jenny and Leo, even though he knew they'd be just as afraid as he was. During lunch, Max found them at their usual table. Jenny was poking at her food, lost in thought, while Leo was attempting to balance a pencil on his nose. Max took a deep breath before speaking, knowing the weight of the words he was about to say would change everything. We need to go behind that door, Max said quietly, leaning in so no one else could overhear. Jenny's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and Leo's pencil tumbled off his nose. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The air around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for someone to speak. Are you serious? Jenny asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Max nodded. I don't think we have a choice. There's something back there, something important. We need to know what it is. Leo shook his head, looking skeptical. I don't know, man. That door's creepy. And don't get me started on Mrs. Gristle. She's not like any teacher I've ever seen. It's like she's always watching us. I've heard it too, Max said, his voice steady. The whispers, they're calling me. I think they're calling us. We can't just ignore it. Jenny looked back and forth between them, her face conflicted. Okay, but what if we're wrong? What if it's some kind of trap? Mrs. Gristle doesn't seem like the kind of person who'd let us wander around, poking our noses where they don't belong. I don't think we can trust her, Leo muttered, glancing over his shoulder toward the teacher's lounge, as though Mrs. Gristle might be lurking there. But we've got to do something. If we don't, we'll never know what's really going on. Jenny bit her lip, clearly torn, but after a long pause, she nodded reluctantly. All right, but we have to be careful. If we get caught, there's no telling what she might do. Max felt a mix of excitement and fear wash over him. This was it. They were really going to go behind the door, and once they did, there was no turning back. That afternoon, when the bell rang to signal the end of class, the three of them lingered behind, pretending to pack up their things. Max kept his eyes on the door, which was slightly ajar as it always was. Mrs. Gristle was sitting at her desk, her back to them as she scrawled something in her notebook. For a brief moment, Max thought he saw something flicker in the corner of his eye, something moving in the shadows behind the door. He swallowed hard, but forced himself to stay calm. Leo was the first to move, slinking toward the back of the room, while Max and Jenny followed close behind. They moved quietly, trying not to draw attention to themselves. As they passed their desks, Max felt a strange weight in the air, like they were being pulled toward the door. Jenny reached out and grabbed his sleeve, her hand trembling. Max, what if it's not a good idea? She whispered urgently. Max didn't answer. He couldn't explain why, but he felt like this was something they had to do. They had no choice. As they neared the door, Max's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The room was eerily quiet, and the whispering seemed to fade away, like the darkness itself was holding its breath. Max reached out and pushed the door open a little further, the creaking sound of the hinges slicing through the silence. As the door swung open, The shadows inside seemed to stretch outward, as if the darkness itself was alive. Max stepped inside, and his eyes struggled to adjust to the deeper darkness beyond. The room was small and cramped, with shelves lining the walls, each one filled with strange, old objects that Max couldn't identify. At the far end of the room stood a tall, ancient-looking mirror, its surface cracked and warped, reflecting nothing but darkness. Max's breath caught in his throat. There was something wrong with that mirror. It wasn't just old, it felt like it was more than a mirror, like it held some kind of power. He could feel its pull, like it was calling to him, urging him to come closer. He stepped forward, his feet moving on their own, and the air around him grew cold. Jenny and Leo stayed at the door, their faces pale with fear. "I don't like this, Max," Jenny said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave." But Max couldn't tear his eyes away from the mirror. Something inside him, something deep within his gut, told him that the answers they were looking for were right there, within the reflection of the broken glass. Before he could stop himself, he reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, everything around him seemed to shift. The shadows in the room began to twist and writhe, and the whispers, now louder than ever, filled his ears. "Max? Max? You've come? Come to set us free." Max recoiled, his heart racing as the voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. The mirror's surface rippled, like water disturbed by a stone, and Max realized with a sinking feeling that he had just unlocked something he wasn't ready to face. The moment Max touched the mirror, everything changed. It felt as though the very air around him thickened, pressing against him like an invisible force. The whispers that had been faint and distant before now surged forward, drowning out all other sound. Max pulled his hand back in a panic, but it was as if the mirror had latched onto him, holding him in place. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last, and he could barely breathe, overwhelmed by the strange, suffocating presence that seemed to fill the room. Jenny and Leo were still standing by the door, their faces pale with fear. Max could see their mouths moving, but the sound of their voices was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers. He could no longer make out the individual words. They all blended together, a unified chant, but one phrase stood out, ringing clear above all the rest. "Set us free." The chill in the room deepened, and Max shivered uncontrollably, his eyes wide with terror. What was happening? What had he unlocked? He instinctively took a step back, but the mirror's surface rippled once again, pulling him in. The shadows around him seemed to reach out, swirling like dark tendrils, and the room began to feel smaller, more confined. It was as if the space was bending around him, becoming something else entirely. "Max! Max! What did you do?" Leo's voice finally broke through the overwhelming whispers. His words were frantic, and Max could hear the tremor in his voice. Max tried to respond, to tell them that he didn't understand, that it wasn't his fault, but his throat was constricted. The words caught in his chest. His legs felt heavy, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift, as though it was no longer solid. He reached out for something, anything to hold on to, but the air around him seemed to warp, distorting the classroom into a surreal, nightmarish version of itself. Jenny's voice pierced the fog of confusion. "Max! Look out!" Before Max could react, something dark surged from the mirror. It wasn't solid, but it was real. He could feel the cold, clammy tendrils brush against his skin, wrapping around him like a cold, suffocating fog. Panic surged through him as he realized that it wasn't just the mirror that was alive, it was everything in the room. The darkness, the shadows, they were all connected, feeding off the power that had been unleashed. "Get away from the mirror!" Jenny cried. She was moving toward him now, despite the fear in her eyes. Leo was close behind her, looking as if he might bolt at any moment. Max tried to pull back, but the shadows held him in place, tightening their grip. The whispers grew louder, the voices now frantic, filled with longing and hunger. They weren't calling for freedom anymore. They were calling for him. "Help us. Help us, Max." Max's head was spinning, and he struggled against the shadows, but the more he fought, the tighter they became. It was as if the darkness was feeding off his fear, growing stronger with each passing second. His hands were numb, and his vision blurred as the world around him continued to distort. The classroom, the walls, the door, it all seemed to shift and bend like he was trapped in some otherworldly dimension. Then, through the haze of confusion and fear, Max saw something. A flicker of light in the darkness, a crack in the shadows. The light seemed to pulse, beckoning him, and instinctively, he reached for it. As his fingers brushed the light, the shadows recoiled, shrinking back like creatures afraid of the light's power. "Max!" Jenny shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. "You have to fight it! We're losing you!" With every ounce of strength he had left, Max yanked himself away from the mirror, away from the darkness that had almost consumed him. The shadows resisted, but with one final push, he broke free. The mirror's surface rippled once more, and the voices screamed in frustration as Max stumbled back, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Jenny and Leo were at his side in an instant, pulling him away from the mirror, guiding him back toward the door. Max felt disoriented, as if the room itself were still spinning, but slowly, the darkness seemed to recede, the oppressive weight lifting off his chest. When they reached the door, Max looked back one last time. The mirror was once again still, its surface now normal, reflecting nothing but the shadows of the room. But Max knew that whatever had been unleashed had not gone away. The whispers, the darkness, it was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to return. "Are you okay?" Jenny asked, her voice soft with concern. Max nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was truly okay. His heart was still racing, and his mind felt scrambled, as though he had barely escaped something terrible. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had to leave. They had to get out before the room could consume them completely. Leo, looking even more shaken than Max felt, turned toward the door. "Let's go. I don't care what's going on here. I'm done with this place." Max didn't argue. As they stepped out into the hallway, the door to room 314 swung shut behind them with a final, heavy thud. For the first time since entering the room, Max felt a brief sense of relief. But that relief was fleeting, as he knew that whatever had just happened was only the beginning. The whispers would return. The darkness would come back, and this time it might not let them escape so easily.